Hey guys, Matt here from LimaCharlie. Welcome to another LC101 session. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about enterprise deployment of LimaCharlie. Now, when I say enterprise, what I mean is really mass scale deployment, meaning you've got to install more sensors than you typically would from a hand install. Meaning I'm not running a little lab. I'm going to prepare a package to provide to someone, or I'm going to be deploying across multiple Linux systems or something like that. And what that means is I'm going to need to find a way to automate the install if possible. And I want to be able to scale out as quickly as possible as well. So today's session might be a little bit shorter than our normal sessions, but we are going to focus on some options for enterprise deployment, and then also how to prepare yourself for enterprise deployment as well. That's probably going to be our first topic, because I want to make sure everyone understands some of the key features we've got built into the LimaCharlie platform that allow you to undertake this problem, if you will. Now, this is a good problem to have if you're needing to deploy LimaCharlie to multiple sensors or hundreds or thousands of systems at a time. That's a great thing. We like that problem. And I can tell you that from a platform perspective, we're not going to have any issues scaling or anything like that. However, it will be an important thing to know, especially if you are a managed services provider or you are someone who needs to white label a installation packer for customers, or if you've got your own enterprise and you need to scale install across. This is going to be a great session for that. So with that said, let's go ahead and get right into it. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about from a first perspective. So as we get started, the first thing to understand is some of the tools that we've built out in the LimaCharlie platform to help you achieve this, to help you get to a point of easy deployment. There's a couple of things I'm going to keep up and open as we go through this. You're going to see me walk through the platform itself. You're also going to see me refer to our documentation, because that's going to be an important part of knowing how and where we're deployed and what some of the options are. There's also going to be some really good walkthroughs in our documentation that I want to make sure everyone sees the purposes of, and you'll understand why they are there and how to use them to your best advantage. All right. So when we get down to enterprise deployment, again, remember, I'm talking about deployment at scale here. I'm talking about I need to deploy to multiple dozens or hundreds or thousands of systems, and I want to do so in a contained, automated way that I can have control over and whatnot. The first place I'm going to start you is going to be your installation keys for your particular instance. Now, this is an organization that I've got up and running right here. I'm actually going to zoom in on this so we can see the text maybe a little bit clearer. But you may notice I've prepared and staged a bunch of different installation keys for today's session, and I've given them certain attributes that I'm going to use to my advantage. Now, if you've seen some of my previous LC101 videos, you know that I like to use tags as a pivot point. Tags are something that I can use to filter down detections. I can use them for reporting purposes. I can use them when we talked in the very beginning about deployment. I can use them for easy system categorization. Tags are also going to be something that I'm going to use to help guide my installation process and also to manage enterprise-wide deployments of LimaCharlie. And there's a couple of different things to be aware of when it comes to tagging and ways to use them. So first and foremost, you may see looking through this, I've got a bunch of different tags built out for any types of systems that I might end up deploying to. So I've got some tags in here for Chromebooks. I've been doing some work on our recent Canary integration. I've got one for Linux workstations, Mac OS, Windows workstations, Chromebooks, so on and so forth. And notice that in my tags, I'm including, this is a lab environment that I've got set up. So lab is one of my first tags. But notice that when I use lab, I'm speaking directly towards different systems in here. I'm also going to use my tags to designate certain attributes about some of the systems that I'm going to be installing to. So for example, I was doing some testing against a network attached storage platform, a network attached storage platform, a NAS, if you will. And I labeled that lab NAS storage. The important consideration here is that I might have tags that straddle across different installation keys, and there's going to be a reason or an intention for that. So the first is, I might want to have everything in a lab perspective, and I might use that as a denotion that it's a physical system inside of a lab, perhaps. Or I might go as far as to say, you know what, my lab is going to be inside of a self-contained environment, whereas my AWS is going to be in the cloud or other types of applications, whatever it might be. Perhaps I'm going to use operating system and then specific system functionality to help determine what my taggers are going to look like or how I'm going to use those installation keys as well. So a good example of that would be what we've got down here in the in the Windows workstations and Linux workstations. My Linux workstations are all virtual machines. So I've declared them as VM workstations lab. Windows workstations, these are physical systems. So I'm not going to put VM in there. Windows workstation. Again, it gives me a couple different ways to address my environment. So I could easily drop in a filter somewhere and say, okay, I'm looking for a thing as long as the tag is Windows. But see, there's another approach we could take that makes things a little bit easier. And let me talk through creating two keys and how these might be beneficial for us. So in this case, I'm going to create a key, and let's just say we're about to enter an enterprise deployment. And I know that I'm going to be deploying to Windows servers as well. So I might say, all right, well, I know I'm in a lab environment. Okay, this is going to be Windows, and they're going to be a server in this case. And I'm going to deploy that there, and I'm going to create one more, which is going to be my Linux servers. And again, I'm pivoting with servers again to workstations here. And I'm going to say lab, Linux, and server in this case. And I know that they're all going to be VM or they're all going to be virtual. And it doesn't matter. I can apply as many tags as I need to in this case. But take a look at some of the differences in how those got applied. So first off, my Windows servers and my Windows workstations, they fall in the same bucket of being in my lab. They fall in the same bucket of both being Windows, but then the server workstation becomes another designation I can use. Furthermore, or not furthermore, but similarly, look at the way I kind of pieced out my Linux systems in this case. Linux workstations versus servers, lab, Linux, VM. So I've got I've got three pools that are shared, and technically I should probably have virtual over here as well. But then server workstation becomes my delineation between the two. The important distinction here is that I've also got a cross straddle where I've got a cross categorization between Windows servers and Linux servers, or Linux workstations and Windows workstations. That workstation tag binds those together. And what I'm doing here, and it may kind of seem a little like, Matt, why are we spending so much time on this right here? Because before I can deploy anything at an enterprise scale, I need to have, or it's best to have, my installation keys lined up and ready to go. My reason for saying this is because I want to be able to address these systems differently from the onset. What I don't want to do, what I want to avoid doing is creating an organization. And let me just see if I can jump into one really quick. What I don't want to do is create an organization like this. Let's just call this systems. And I'm just going to say computer. And I'm keeping it really high level and hopefully somewhat comical here. But I don't want to get to a point where I just create one installation key and I'm pushing everything up against that one installation key. First off, you totally could if you wanted to. But the issue that you're going to run into is you're not going to be able, or I should say, it's going to be very difficult for you to have to discern between the different key characteristics and features in your detection and response rules, perhaps in your outputs as you work through them, or in the way that you address your systems as well. So if I wanted to get down to the CLI level and I wanted to start to address these systems differently, meaning maybe I'm going to tag all of my Windows servers with another tag, critical assets or crown jewels or something like that, it's going to be very difficult for me to do that. What I've seen in the past in other platforms that I've worked in is folks start to group and classify systems by IP address or by host name, some sort of delineation, or some sort of services running or something. And the problem with that is you get down to a point where you're delineating based on services running on the system or things that are easily changed on the systems as well. So if I was to group a bunch of systems together by IP address, I'm hoping that those IP addresses would never change. but also it's going to be very difficult because every time, and this is where we get to an efficiency scale, every time I do something against those systems, I'm going to have to include that filter every single time. So again, hypothetically, let's say I've got 2 geographic locations, California and Texas, and I give everything the same installation key. And then later on down the line, I use some sort of IP delineation to say, all right, these are all my Texas systems. These are all my California systems. Well, let's say I wanted to treat those systems differently. Let's say we were in an IR and I had to start to apply crown jewel tags or access tags or compromise tags or things like that. I'm then going to have to deal with, well, wait, which state are they in? Where are they located? And my tags may end up being a little bit of an extra step in the thought process that I could have easily solved at the installation key level by simply saying, here's an installation key for Texas, here's one for California, here's one for workstations, here's one for servers, and it lets you address them very differently, number one. Number two, it also is a really slick way for you to write enterprise-wide detection and response rules. And let me talk about that for a second before we get into the deployment side of things. Let's take a typical Active Directory setup, an on-prem Active Directory setup. Let's say you've got a domain controller, and that domain controller, and again, we're thinking enterprise today, so I'm going to be thinking in dozens or hundreds of systems. Let's say you've got a domain controller, and that domain controller is providing a bunch of different services out to your environment. Primarily, though, it is the domain controller, so it's facilitating, and it and its counterparts are facilitating an authentication, account verification, different enterprise functionality, login, so on and so forth. That domain controller, first off, is in itself, or it and its counterparts are in their own little group inside of the organization, number one. Number two, the detection and response rules that you apply to a domain controller should be very different than the detection and response rules that you apply to a user workstation. I'll make the same similar distinction between just a server and a workstation. The types of detection rules that I apply against a server should be different against the type of detections that I apply against a workstation, primarily because of what I expect to see on those systems. A server, I would not, unless it's like a jump box or a bastion system or something like that, I would not expect to see a lot of user interaction. Similarly to a workstation, I would not expect to see a lot of services running. And what the installation key level lets you do is lets you say, I'm going to declare what these things are right at the beginning. And then I can easily bring in detection and response rules from anywhere. So here's my final example about why installation keys are very critical and very useful and why we want to set them up before we even get into enterprise-wide deployment. Let's say I write a detection and response rule, and that detection and response rule looks for evidence of a running web server. I'm going to try to use this to identify all my web servers in the environment. And I say, fire a detection every single time the IIS or Apache or Tomcat or whatever web server is found running. Well, the issue with that is going to be, well, hold on. Is it possible for these applications to ever be running on a workstation? Maybe, not entirely sure. Would either of those cases cause suspicion? 100%. It might be something why would I be running a web server on a workstation, on a user workstation? Could be legitimate, could be something testing. But if I'm able at the high level tag level to say, show me every time a web server is running. And if it's a server, do this. If it's a workstation, display that. I now get the ability to customize my detection and response rules. But wait, I can take that same detection and response rule. And if you're a managed provider and you've got multiple customers, I can take that detection and response rule and apply it to all of my different customer environments because I utilize tagging at the installation key level. If we reverse that logic and say, you know what, I'm just going to use one installation key and then I'm going to filter the data based on the hosts that check in, I now have a single instantiated detection and response rule. I can't take that DNR rule anywhere else. So I've effectively made more work for my team. Anyways, that's enough time. That's about 10 to 15 minutes spent on installation keys, but it is one of the most important things you can do as you start to prepare for enterprise deployment. And I've given you a list of reasons why I want you to use that process to make life a little simpler. So the first step in enterprise deployment is going to be figuring out what you need to deploy to, and then subsequently creating those buckets of installation keys and having those things working. So that way you're able to focus on the groupings and then customizing the installers as need be. So there's step one, focusing on installation keys and the diversity of installation keys. Step two is going to be preparing that particular package to be sent out in whatever way. Now, some folks go different ways when it comes to deploying at the enterprise level. I'll obviously bring up a few examples. The first is if I'm going to deploy on a Windows system or in a Windows heavy environment or across the Windows systems inside of my environment, you might be utilizing a couple of different options. The first one might be something like a central Windows management option like Group Policy, PowerShell, SCCM, or Microsoft Intune in order to deploy things out. Nothing wrong with any of those approaches. We've got actually some documentation across almost all of those. By the way, if we're missing one, let me know and I'll work on getting it in there, number one. However, all of those different approaches rely on the same starter building blocks, which for a Windows environment is going to be an EXE or an MSI. So instead of going down each one of those roads, I'm going to instead today just focus on how I get to that prepackaged MSI or prepackaged ESE ready to go. Linux is going to be very, very similar. Mac is going to be in its own world as well. The key thing that for you to remember between all of these is that I've got to include the installation key that I want in order to make sure the agent checks into the right bucket or to the right group. So maintaining your fleet of installation keys is going to be the most important part. From there, we're just adding variables to executables and certain installers. So I will start from the Windows side of things. And again, I'm focused on our sensor page, and I'll zoom in just a little bit so we can see kind of what's going on here. I'm going to start on our at the Windows side of this. So we offer right out of the box an EXE as well as an MSI, both 32 and 64-bit for both applications there. Your EXE is going to be very straightforward. It is an executable. It's a binary. It runs. You provided a TAC-I installation key. You provide a TAC-I with your installation key afterwards, and it installs on that one system. A couple notes about that. An EXE with a variable is a very low-key, very basic installation. What I mean by that is there's not much pre-packaging to it. There's not much of a variable inclusion. It is meaning your installation key. It is something that you have to kind of specify every single install. Now, you could certainly copy and paste back and forth. As long as you've got the installer, you're easily able to move that around, but it becomes very cumbersome. It's very cumbersome to take a text file or an installer or something and ship those around all over the place. You've got multiple moving pieces. There's things that might unfortunately fall apart. And it's possible someone may change the installation key. It's possible that someone may alter the data, edit something. And I've got this really complex process of like shipping around an EXE and a text file or a copy paste and installation key. There's a lot of room for error inside of that. So the other nice thing that we offer is the MSI. The other nice thing about an MSI is that it also bundles with the Windows Installation Manager, which means that high-level system on a Windows operating system that kind of keeps track of all your installed programs. So for example, if any of you are used to going to the control panel and checking out your installed programs and removing or deleting from there, that's done through the Windows Installation Manager. It keeps track of what's installed on the system. There's registry keys for it, all sorts of things on the back end that help monitor, directory paths, locations, and whatnot. If I go and just run an executable and give it a TAC-I in this case for LimaCharlie, that's not going to be reflected inside of my control panel or inside of my, installed applications. And MSI will get you to that point. So the first difference from an enterprise perspective between the EXE and the MSI is going to be how much operating system control and visibility do I want to have into this particular thing. The same approach is actually going to apply at Linux and Mac as well when we get there. For now, I'm just going to stick with the Windows side of things. So for that reason, again, the MSI tends to be the preferred place for enterprise-wide deployments because it does bump you up into that Windows management installer. But one of the issues here is that you do need to still continue to include the installation key inside of your, or not inside of, but with your installer MSI. So we're at the same place. You've got an MSI, but you need to provide it a variable. Well, there is actually a way to go through and include these things together. So I went through and pulled up our documentation here. And interestingly enough, there is a really good article inside of here that talks about creating an MSI wrapper. Now, because I'm not on a Windows system at the moment, I'm going to walk through the screenshots for this, but I will highly recommend if you are installing on Windows, go ahead and build this out and keep it on standby. And we'll talk about some different options as we work through this. There is a third-party tool that we use in this example here called EXE MSI. And EXE MSI is a tool that you can use to bundle an EXE and turn it into an MSI. But wait, Matt, you guys already have an MSI. Why on earth would I go use this one? Well, remember, we've got to provide that installation key on the install. I want a way to bundle the installation key together with the MSI, so that, or the EXE. So that way, all I have to do is give my system or my IT admins or my whomever, hey, here's an MSI, just install it and you're on your way. Everything else is taken care of in the back end. So heading back to our documentation, what it does is it walks you through, once again, pulling down the LimaCharlie EXE, wrapping it into, putting it into EXE MSI. And the most important part is going to be, again, coming down here to the bottom. And there's a bunch of different steps that talk about visibility, talk about if we're going to have it wrapped, talk about if we want it to show up inside of the Windows control panel, setting this user security, the security and the user context. These are all the important things that we want to have in place because, again, I need the sensor to have system level privileges, but I do want to make sure I adhere to the different security controls that may be in place inside of the environment. There is an interesting side of things here. In the upgrade code section, you want to make sure you select the create new button. This will be used to allow uninstallation of the sensor if need be. And there's also an opportunity to drop in a icon if need be, which lets you, again, convert the executable over to an MSI and include a nice little icon. Makes it easy to ship around if you think. But that being said, I don't want to spend too much time walking through all this. I'm going to get to this point right here, and that's step 11 in the process. So let me summarize here. Up until this point, all we've done is taken an EXE, started to create an MSI wrapper for that EXE, and we've done some very basic steps, such as declaring whether the system and security privileges, whether it will show up and be visible in the control panel and whatnot. Everything so far has been fairly straightforward. But the big difference or the differentiator here is going to be the point where I come down here to insert my installation key. And this is where I'm going to bundle the parameter, the TAC I, into the MSI itself. Let's pause. So what I'm doing is I'm breaking away from the LimaCharlie provided MSI, and I'm taking the LimaCharlie EXE, bundling it with my installation key, and creating a custom MSI, in this case right here, a custom MSI that includes that installation key inside of the MSI itself. And I'm just going to click on my way down through and whatnot, or not click, but I'm going to scroll down through the documentation, going down. And you'll notice that in this case right here, a completed MSI is going to include the installation key. It's also going to include all sorts of information we'd expect to see inside of a typical install. So I'm going to see things like title, subject, EXIF information, details that I'm not going to get inside of an executable, and it is not customed in this case. Now, this article does talk about building a custom MSI installer for Windows. The approach there was if you wanted to rename it to something yourself, but it is the exact same approach if you just wanted to create a portable MSI, meaning I just want to include an installation key and an EXE inside of that one package. And that's where we get to this particular point. The final screenshot here does talk about the custom installed package. And if you notice, you can use this to kind of remove the name LimaCharlie from it if you need to. Full disclosure, for anyone who's in an incident response scenario or a scenario where an adversary is perhaps aware of the software on the system, renaming your software can be a really easy way to evade their initial detection. Because I'll tell you right now, if you go and install LimaCharlie on a compromised system, they might come back and say, hey, one Google search showed us this is security software. I won't go down that line, but let's just keep it steady with saying a prepackaged MSI is a really easy way to add some customization details if you want to. Again, it's also an easy way, and I'm scrolling up through my documentation here. It's also an easy way to include your installation key ahead of time. So to summarize at this point, what I've got now is I've got a standalone MSI that has an installation key included with it. This is where managing your installation keys from a LimaCharlie perspective can become very useful, because now I can create a Windows Server deployment MSI or a Windows Workstation deployment MSI or a laptop MSI. And instead of me needing to maintain a bunch of different installation keys and line things up, get into the practice or get into the habit of, when you create an installation key and it's for a Windows system, hop over and create that self-contained MSI and then name it accordingly. LimaCharlie _ workstation installer or server installer. And then what you've got is a nice little cache on your side of an CACHE, a nice little repository of installers ready to go with pre-packaged installation keys. I can ship those and push them out anywhere in the environment as need be, and then subsequently say, all right, here's your server install, let's go. And then I can do the installation filtering at the deployment level and say, I want to hit all servers or I want to hit all workstations and have them check back in accordingly. Now, one thing I will note, when you get to an enterprise deployment perspective, you're going to look a little bit like this. One thing here is you might notice my current sensor version, or the sensor that I've got installed, is out of date. And I kind of intentionally kept it here for a reason. There's a couple of ways to get around this, but let's talk about the manual and then automated approach. So at this point, I've deployed out to dozens or hundreds of systems, whatever it is. By the way, remember in the beginning, I talked about how an MSI is going to be that key building block to mass deployment. At this point, with those self-contained MSIs, you can then walk into any deployment approach you need to. Group policy, GPO-based approach, again, an SCCM or a third-party tool or an Intune, those all have the ability to operate or work off of MSIs. So that MSI is that initial starting building block. But you may be like, well, Matt, hold on. Do I need to build an MSI for every single agent version that comes out? Meaning, do I need to just constantly be redoing this all the time? Absolutely not. The nice thing about the LimaCharlie installer is the fact that I can roll an outdated version out there. I'm still going to get, again, the telemetry that I'm used to seeing, but I might be like, well, hold on, I'm behind the curve on a couple of different features or things that have been announced. Maybe there's something else I want to take advantage of. Not a problem. There's two ways around this. The first way around it is at my tagging level. Remember my installation keys? My first area of tagging, we could insert a tag here at my installation keys that includes something like LC stable or LC latest. I'm going to pull up some documentation here to walk through this in just a second. I could use my, yeah, there we go. I could use my tagging if I wanted to keep those things up to date from an installation key perspective. I could also use my tagging to keep it at a stable version. And I'm going to get out of this one here. I want to hop over to my installation keys, and I'm going to hop to another demo instance really quick. And here we go. So there's a couple of other potential installation keys that could be used. LC:system, LC, let's see. I'm going to head back to my lab. There we go. I could create a key if I wanted to and said Windows bleeding edge. And I'm going to do Windows, Lab, Workstation, and then LC latest. And what that's going to do is that tag is going to be something that forces an update down. Meaning, when a new sensor version gets deployed, it's going to automatically look for that particular tag. And I've got a session about this right here. I've got some documentation on this right here. Give me 1 second. Let me highlight the right part about this. Okay, perfect. Yeah, there we go. So one way to auto update with the newest version is going to also be the LC stable tag. Now you might notice I've got a couple of different versions. I've got the latest version and I've also got the stable version. One way to keep your sensors always at the stable version is going to be with an LC:stable tag. I could also use an LC latest tag to force down an auto update if I needed to. But what that does is it lets me control sensor versions at the tag or at the, kind of mass enterprise level. I feel like I jumped around for a moment, so let me recenter and remind everyone where we're at. Again, today's session is focused on enterprise deployment. We're talking about Windows, and we're also talking about once I've got multiple sensors deployed, how do I go about updating them? The way that I got here, the way that our thought process brought us here was if we go and create custom MSI installers for Windows installs, do I need to maintain and update those installers all the time to ensure that I'm running the latest version at the install? That's the way we got here. And I'm going to go back and say, no, you don't. I could push out a slightly out of date installer without causing any issues, come into here and simply use my web app or an API call to upgrade to the latest version. Upgrading happens behind the scenes. It is completely transparent to the users. And in fact, this spinning wheel inside of the web app is about as much interaction as I'm going to get with those particular systems. Here's the key reason why this is important to know. When we talk about enterprise deployment, we are talking about things like managing versions, so version control. We're talking about managing multiple different systems. We're talking about a lot of different moving pieces that are often done at the enterprise deployment level. So if I'm using Microsoft Intune, for example, Intune is going to want to be the one that controls the versioning and the deployment and the upgrades, and we're going to want to have all that stuff available. The MSI installer can help you get there. But we at LimaCharlie don't want you to have to redeploy an MSI every time a single upgrade is made. Instead, you can deploy once and then utilize the platform to help push out those updates for you. And you can automate that as well. So again, what that does is it takes away the need for you having to maintain version control across the agents. It lets you create those self-contained MSIs, drop an installation key in, provide that thing out, and then upgrade when you need to at the web app level, allowing for easier, more automated deployment. So you might notice there's some pieces in here and some things that we've done that make it a little bit easier for you to manage from an enterprise perspective. All right. So that's Windows. Hopefully everyone followed me along that thought process. Again, it gets to be a little tricky because once you talk about enterprise-wide deployments, we're not just talking about, well, I've got 5 agents running or 5 sensors running in a lab, and I can just click through and update tags as need be, and we're all set, right, Matt? This is easy. No, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of systems. And how can I use tagging? How can I use enterprise deployment options? How can I use third-party controls and installation keys? And how can I use all sorts of automated processes to help me maintain that fleet, again, without needing a really comprehensive kind of version control or version management system on top of all this? That same thing that I just talked about, that same approach for installation keys and that same approach for managing versions and things are also going to apply to Linux and Mac, which we're going to talk about next. So again, I spent some time on Windows. When we get to Linux, which is the one I'll focus on just next, our Linux installer is actually fairly diverse, but also fairly simple and straightforward. We have everything from 32 and 64-bit. We have Debian packages available, .debs. We also have support for Alpine 64, ARM, ARM 64, and then ARM 1 as well. So a few different options there from a Linux perspective. I won't get into Docker installs today. That might be our next session, but just notice that we do have Docker installs available as well in case you're unfamiliar with that. But the Linux installer is going to be dependent first on your operating system level. What I mean by that is there's different kernel versions, there's different operating system management or package management systems on there. So depending on what I use to deploy is going to largely be dependent on the flavor of Linux that I'm running to or I'm installing to. And again, your installation keys may or may not be useful from that particular approach. So notice here, I've got Linux servers and Linux workstations. That's fairly straightforward. It just delineates based on system functionality. If we wanted to use installation keys to delineate a little further, you could do, for example, like Red Hat servers or Debian servers or Ubuntu or anything like that. And again, all you're doing is dropping a separate tag in to help you delineate between what's this and what's not. It could be an easy way to manage controls. But if you wanted to use your sensors for some additional visibility and insight, like let's say, for example, I was going to use the installed packages feature across some of my systems, the OS packages command, and I was looking for installed packages on a system, that approach might be very different on a Linux, on a Red Hat system than on a Debian system, for example. And I'm using two high-level flavors as example, CentOS versus Debian, if you will. We'll keep it open source. But regardless, my point remains the same. Installation keys can become that first high level of delineation. However, we should understand that Linux is not as clean, and I use that word very sparingly, so hang tight with me, not as clean as a pre-packaged MSI. Typically, the way that we would want to kind of put together a deployment from a Linux perspective would be an automated script that could use something like wget or curl to pull down the installer. Notice our installers are at default locations. These location values do not change. I would want to use an installer to pull those down and then subsequently run through the installation. And you could use something like a bash script in order to do that. Inside of our sensor installation here, there are a couple of documents or a couple of scripts that we have linked to that will help you with some of the automated installations here. There's one, this is just a basic Linux installer. It's a script that you run as root. And what you do is you simply provide the script with the path to the executable or the binary, and then the installation key that you want to use to install that particular sensor. Notice there's a lot of variables built in here. The other thing that it does is it also installs the sensor side of the as a service. So as a daemon. So you do get the kind of survives reboot, the persistence mechanism put in place here. However, you could also obviously go in, grab this script, and we can go right to the raw version if we want. We could make some modifications of this script to fit our particular use case if need be. I'm going to move myself out of the way. You could go through and again, drop in some customization if need be inside of this particular script to focus on your installation keys and focus on the approach that you have or the things that you need for those Linux systems. There is also a systemd installer that we have available. Same exact thing. Rather than using the init.d, though, it uses systemd from a persistence perspective. But both are very useful for installing the agent or the sensor as a background process. And one thing I would recommend doing is getting familiar with some of these scripts. If you've got to install across a Linux system, getting familiar with some of these scripts, dropping in a quick curl or wget to pull down the sensor, do everything out of temp, and you're good to go. You can just use that as your kind of unified approach. Inside of our Linux documentation, I do have some references towards this as well. It is very much in line with what I've been saying so far. Remember, once again, that we do offer the ability, or sorry, not offer, but I should say our download paths are static. They don't change, so you can easily script against them if need be. Notice as well inside of our documentation, we do have some information about enterprise sensor deployment with a link towards Microsoft Intune and whatnot. But going back to our original documentation page, I want to make sure I point out once again, from a Linux perspective, the approach is going to be very easy from a single or a handful of agents. But if I need to get to the point where I am having to scale this out, I'm going to want to utilize scripts or package managers. Speaking of package managers, we do offer a Debian package available. You could easily utilize dpackage to pull that down. Full disclosure, you can't hop into apt-get and bring that down, or aptitude to bring these down. You will need to push the binary or push the installer around. That's a little bit by design because, again, you need the installation key in order for it to work. But there are some scripts that we've made available that make it really easy for you to pull these down. Quick note about Linux installs, everything around Debian 5, I think CentOS maybe 3 or 4. I can't remember the CentOS equivalent version, but regardless, we do have support across the majority of Linux flavors that are out there and currently in production. However, I will note, if you do come across that and you are looking for a version or a flavor that we do not cover or you don't seem to have coverage for, let us know. BSD, for example, is one option that folks have been requesting for a little bit of time that we'll probably likely work on in the background and make available. However, let me just summarize Linux side of things. I'll hop back to my installation list here. A Linux installer from an enterprise perspective is not, as I said, as bundled or as straightforward as an MSI. You could, however, create a script that could be passed around. Our install paths are static, and you can script against those install paths to push out an automated installation script if need be. Let that thing run and it automatically installs into the background and you're good to go. Mac is going to run very similar to Linux from an installation perspective. What I mean by that is I'm going to download an installer, I'm going to chmod it plus X to make it executable, and I'm going to install it using an installation key. Again, that's not as a clean bundle as you get inside of a Windows MSI package, but my deployment scripts or a deployment script that you write could work the exact same way, depending on the installation keys that you would have to use. I do have some some information in here about Mac OS and deploying sensors from there. So the different operating systems that you're going to have are going to be where the differentiator comes in. So I'm just going to bring these up. An older operating system version from a Mac perspective is going to look a little bit different than a newer Mac version. And the version delineation we have is between 10.14 and prior, or 10.15 and newer. There's going to be some differences between those two. Again, we're going to grab our installation key, and it's going to be the system preferences, the ones that's going to be the biggest difference, is going to be where I declare and determine what the sensor has access to. Inside of my security or system preferences is where that's going to be done if I have interactive control over the system, meaning if I can get hands-on with the system and allow and let things go, then meaning what I mean by that is make allowances, make security exceptions, allow these through the policy, then I can easily just do this and click through it. However, this is enterprise deployment. So we have included as well in our documentation something that you can use to utilize MDM configuration profiles to deploy LimaCharlie across an enterprise fleet. And once again, this is going to be very similar to a Windows approach where I've got some sort of software that's going to assist me with deployment. And I'm going to be creating a configuration profile that lets me push this out. Scrolling down through our documentation, we will be going through from an MDM perspective and declaring exactly what needs to happen when the sensor gets installed. We are going to be allowing it to have full disk access. We're going to allow the network filter, although you might not see that on newer versions of LimaCharlie. We're also going to allow it or have it be as a system extension. Pardon me. Need to get some water or coffee. We're also going to configure it as an application extension as well. Once that profile is out there and we've actually provided a sample that you can use, you can then use that MDM profile from an installer perspective and push that out throughout your environment if you're utilizing some sort of MDM management software. Again, that's going to include network content filter, full disk access, and system extension. One other thing as well is that you might also want to create a silent installation, meaning I don't want the user to see what's going on. In this case, there is a sample plist file that we provided that you can use. Dropping this into library preferences on the endpoint will give you a silent installation option. I can subsequently push down LimaCharlie and my user is not going to know about it. We do have some documentation here on using Jamf Pro. Again, it's just another example, folks, of an enterprise deployment software that I could use. This is where I am importing that MDM configuration profile. I am specifying it to be LimaCharlie. We're dropping in some of the different identifiers and code requirements that it has, so on and so forth. I'm going to, again, configure all of this inside of that third-party software. This is not LimaCharlie. This is Jamf Pro. Configuring it as a system extension, specifying a display name, team identifier, so on and so forth. Again, this is not a Jamf LC101 walkthrough. It's a deployment walkthrough, so my configuration settings are going to be fairly consistent. There's lots of other content filters that go in. By the way, Mac has one of the most stringent MDM installation policies. But that being said, at the very bottom here, once I've got all of these different variables and values built in, using something like a Jamf Pro, that configuration profile then lets me push LimaCharlie out to my Mac systems enterprise-wide or anywhere that Jamf has been installed. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Jamf, not sure. Regardless, it is a really easy way to manage that at the enterprise level. So in summary, And this felt like a lot of kind of rabbit holes and technical walkthroughs that we went through. The goal here was to talk about some of the different options from an enterprise deployment. First, we started with Windows and we took a look at, or I should actually say, first we started with the installation keys. I spent as much time there as I did because the installation keys are going to be your first area of control when the systems check back in that you install on. So I'm going to want to create that bucket of installation keys that lets me tag things and use detection and response rules and different delineation at the very beginning, number one. Number two, we then walked through the three primary operating systems and how we'd want to deploy in mass: Windows, Linux, and Mac. From a Windows perspective, we talked about the standalone executable all the way to a bundled MSI that includes my predefined installation key that I can then provide out from an installation perspective. And as I said, most enterprise software, enterprise deployment software, Intune, SCCM, GPO, whatever it might be, is going to utilize or need that MSI in order to be portable. We talked about Linux. Linux has a standalone binary. We've also got the Debian package or the D package installer. Either way, I'm going to want to utilize some sort of script to help automate or control that deployment. Our sensor installation or our sensor binaries are in static locations, so you can curl wget script against those locations, pull them down, and provide your installation key. Similar to maintaining a repository of MSIs ready to go. If you've got different flavors of Linux or even Windows, a server versus a workstation, I might even go as far as having a server install script or a workstation install script and just keep that ready to go. Remember, I talked about the coverage between different Linux flavors and that some of your package managers might be different. So I might even want to have flavor-specific install profiles. But if you stick with the high-level 32 or 64-bit, that's not entirely necessary. And we also looked at Mac installation. For all intents and purposes, on standalone or a handful of systems, Mac installation is going to be very similar to Linux. I'm going to pull down a binary, give it an installation key, or go on my way. If I needed to get into more of a customized or a bundled approach on a Mac, we could utilize the same types of scripts. Again, I'd encourage you to recognize the operating system at Mac. There is a point where Mac, for example, switched over to Z Shell. I want to make sure Bash is still on there and it's still usable, but I'm going to want to make sure I utilize the right shell calls and the right references. We went all the way to using a Mac MDM manager, something like a Jamf, in order to create that configuration profile ahead of time so that I can easily deploy out to my enterprise if need be. And as I mentioned, we do provide sample files here inside of our documentation. Everything from a sample LimaCharlie MDM config, a plist for silent installation, as well as a walkthrough in using Jamf Pro. With that said, I've covered really a lot of the high-level bases of enterprise-wide installation. Note, everyone, this is an LC101 session. We spent at a high-level topic talking about enterprise deployment. We do have subsequent documentation, as you saw, for example, on using Jamf, on Microsoft Intune, and we will be creating content for those very specific installs. But I didn't want this session today to be, here's how to use Intune to install, or here's how to use Jamf. Instead, I wanted to answer, and we did, a lot of questions that come through to us about, hey, I need to deploy to 100, 200, or 1,000 Windows systems. What are my options? How do I go about doing that? And a lot of organizations don't necessarily have the same approach. So therefore, it's good to know, what are my basic building blocks to help me get there? A building block is your starter static binary plus your installation key, and then different ways of packaging and wrapping those together so I can achieve my desired result and deploy at scale. All right, with that said, we're going to finish this session a little bit early today. I highly recommend, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, join us in the community Slack. We would love to see you in there and would love to walk through this a little bit further. This session has been focused on enterprise deployment. And again, the goal here is, hey, Matt, I've got dozens or hundreds or thousands of systems. What are my options for deploying at scale? If you're interested in any of the unique deployment options I talked about, check out our documentation and I'll happily walk through it with you there. Hit me up in Slack, email me, text, whatever it is, Twitter, DM, I'll be around. I'll happily answer any of those questions. And speaking of being around, it is Tuesday, May 2nd. I highly recommend in the future you check us out at our future conference locations. The LimaCharlie team will be present at ThoughtCon, which is going to be in Chicago towards the end of May. I'll be at the first conference in Montreal in the beginning of June. And of course, we got to have a presence at Black Hat, which is going to be in the beginning of August as well. Check the Slack channel for any other upcoming performances. And notice how I made it sound like a band there. And don't forget to check out our upcoming Mission Control Conference, which is going to be in the fall of 2023 out in Northern Virginia/DC. I highly recommend you come check us out there. It's going to be a conference, a full session of building, creating, and what are the different types of ways I can scale cybersecurity. All right, everyone, with that said, I'm signing off. Thanks again for joining me on this LC101 session. I will see you on the next one, and I'll hopefully talk to you soon. Thanks.